The first thing that makes an impression on me about this book is the opening epigram, which deals with the idea of self-contradiction. It's a really interesting quote. I think she paraphrases it, and you don't need to know that it comes from Walt Whitman to know that it's valuable. I don't even think you have to know what Walt Whitman meant by it. But the idea that human beings are self-contradictory is really a very interesting idea, because it seems to go against a lot of what we think in terms of how our thinking should be, what our judgment should be like, how we should reason our way through things. Generally speaking, self-contradiction is not a good thing. It's something that undermines our thought process, it undermines our judgments, and it makes it very easy for someone to devalue what you think. And what she's suggesting in this book is not only is it not something that devalues us, but that it's something that very well might define us as human beings. So then the question is, what does that mean for our thinking, the way we make arguments, our judgments, and how do we then square the idea of what we think about how thinking should work with the way it might actually work? I see this whole book as making statements about how we draw lines about things, how we define things, how we circumscribe things with meanings. And then she gives a bunch of examples that I think, for me, and it's what made the book interesting for me, but also maybe for a first-year student coming into the university, might find really interesting, because these are ideas that I think speak directly to who they are at the moment that they're walking through the door. So for example, she talks about the drinking age, right? She does a lot of research on this. I do think she loads her argument in favor of her opinion, so she doesn't really adduce as much evidence against, but that's fine, it's irrelevant, right? She's making her case. But she's talking about how the federal government has certain stakes in establishing a drinking age at a certain threshold. She's talking about how the states are trying to set it at a certain threshold, and very often the states are in conversation with the federal government and there's a little bit of tension there. But then there's a larger tension between the government and individuals, right? Because individuals want their freedoms and they want to be able to define themselves the way they want to define themselves. So the question is really about then who gets to draw the lines, on what basis are these lines drawn, and then do you accept these foundations and the standards for those lines being drawn the way they are. Another example is when she speaks about the driver's license as this at least presumed vehicle for freedom, right? So you get your driver's license, you jump in the car, you put the top down, and off you go, right? But it's also used to control people. And so then what happens is you reach a certain age and you want your driver's license. I know my son is dying to get his learner's permit the second he turns whatever age it is. I think it's 16 years old in the summer when he can get it. And that gives him some freedom, right? That's always been the pretense. But it also controls you. So why do you desire something that has the potential to control you? Two other ideas that I think are important in her work. She speaks about the idea that human beings, especially in America, seem to be, as she puts it, almost paralyzed by fear. And that's a really interesting idea as well, because fear is very marketable, right? And so if you can convince people to be afraid of things, you might be able to sell them something to help them get rid of their fear, right? And it could be an object, or it could be an idea. So one of the ideas is that we will make you more secure by overseeing your life a little bit more, by interfering in the things you do, to make sure that if someone's trying to do you harm, right, we can catch them before they actually are able to execute that harm, right? So it puts us in a really weird spot, because then we're signing over some of our freedoms, right, on a fear that may or may not be legitimate. So then the question is, what do we do about that? So then we start drawing lines around, ourselves in terms of how we want to be secure, what we're willing to sacrifice to be secure. Because if we're not drawing those lines around ourselves, someone's almost certainly drawing those lines around us. If you're reading this book right now as an incoming student, what Castile is doing is defining you. So if you're looking at this, maybe these are fighting words, right? Maybe she's insulting you. Maybe she's saying something about you that you don't want to hear, right? But if that's the case, if she's in a position as the author of a book to define you like this, and you don't like the way you're being defined, then what do? How do you fight back, right? How do you recontrol that narrative so that you can define yourself the way you want to, rather than have somebody else define you the way they want to? Who gets to draw those lines? I think that's the abiding lesson of this book. And at the end of the day, I actually think that that's what makes this book valuable.